statement by the President of the Commission on economic governance in the EU and the Eurozone and surveillance of national budgets. Welcome again, President Barroso. You have the floor, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. President, honourable members, economic governance is very important for the future of the European Union. And when President Delors expressed the need for proper coordination of economic policies back in 1993, many member states refused that. Then when the first Commission that I had the honour of presiding raised the issue again on the 10th anniversary of Economic and Monetary Union 2008, nobody really listened to us then either. But we did stress the need for an adequate response to the issue of economic governance. I raised this in the guidelines I worked up my presidency a year or so ago, and Olli Rehn, as Commissioner, also debated this with you during his hearing in committee, and the Commission expressed its intentions to present proposals to strengthen economic governance in the EU, particularly in the Eurozone. And the crisis proved us right, unfortunately. But the urgency of the debate is now generally recognised, and we now have the conditions to be able to move towards genuine economic governance in the EU. So the Commission has worked out proposals on the 12th of May, which we've had into the debate, including debate with the European Parliament, and work of the task force chaired by the President of the European Council. And the Commission is pleased at the progress being made in this work and the consensus that has been achieved so far, which was clear during the European Council meeting. So that we can keep this dynamism going, the Commission last Wednesday approved a whole raft of measures to transpose legislative initiatives, which will mean, assuming they are approved in good time, that these can come into force by 2011. These proposals are based on the idea that we need to act straight away. It is not a question of limiting ourselves. We need to recognise that we have possibilities within the Lisbon Treaty which must be fully utilised, because we can't wait any longer. The citizens of Europe and business and the economy requires initiatives from us, and we have a responsibility to act now.
Members of this Parliament, the economic crisis has put the European Union before a series of serious tests. The reinforcement of economic governance is, of course, just one aspect of the European Union response to the crisis. The response has also included other dimensions: the comprehensive reform of the regulation of financial markets and proposals for a new European supervisory architecture. As I said this morning, a deal is within reach in the coming days. I call on all parties to maintain the positive dynamic to ensure that new authorities can start their work in early 2011. This will also keep Europe in the lead in implementing our G20 commitments in this area. The measures to secure financial stability, first through the Greece programme and then through the mechanisms for the euro area as a whole. And last but not least, the programme for growth and jobs through structural reforms included in the Europe 2020 strategy. Our response to the crisis is a holistic one. We stabilise, we consolidate and we modernise. We prepare our social market economy to ensure a better future for our citizens. But for now, let me focus on governance. The challenge of the past few months has centred on whether our economic governance is equal to the new pressures placed on our economic and fiscal stability. We have the treaty provisions in place which allow us to act. We have the institutions we need to make it work. We faced the real risk and we successfully resisted it. Now we are filling in the gaps we have identified to preempt such risks for the future. I first announced to this Parliament the ideas we fleshed out in the Commission communication of the 12th of May. Our debates since then are reflected in the Commission communication of the 30th of June. Now we are moving on the operational phase, with the Commission ready to submit legislative proposals as early as September. Before explaining the issues in detail, I would like to emphasise how much this process has benefited from the work with the European Council, the task force chaired by the President of the European Council, and indeed the deliberations of this Parliament. This work has helped to build a real European momentum. I hope that this will translate later into a swift consideration and swift adoption of legislative proposals. Our approach to economic governance is to have rules that are more comprehensive and more efficient. The current treaty gives us plenty of scope to do this, and I am convinced that the community method will once again give us the right answer. We need a stronger surveillance regime. That means one that is stricter and broader, covering budgetary, macroeconomic and structural policies. A regime that acknowledges the reality that every member state has its own particularities, but a regime which also reflects the interdependence we all know is central to the European economy. And what does this mean in detail? First, we need more coordination. Key to this is the European semester. It will enhance economic transparency and encourage peer reviews ex ante among member states. If member states submit their stability and convergence programmes and their national reform programmes simultaneously, we will have a truly joined-up approach. This European perspective will be an asset for member states as they plan, discuss and adopt their national budgets according to their national constitutional procedures. Second, we need the credibility that comes with better enforcement. This means a refined incentives and sanctions toolbox, a more effective mix of both preventive and corrective action. We need a stability and growth pact that is targeted, not only regarding the deficit criterion, but also on debt. A pact that has real teeth and is respected. Of course, the most effective sanctions are those that do not need to be used, because they create the incentive to comply. But in order to do so, the rules need to be strong enough to command this respect. I want to be very clear on this. Without a more stringent system of incentives and sanctions, we will not reinforce economic governance in a credible way. If a member state does not respect the commonly agreed rules, then it must be prepared to suffer the consequences. This means also that sanctions must be designed so as to apply to all member states on an equal basis. Parliament can be reassured that the Commission will do its utmost to ensure that this will be the case. As regards financial sanctions, we propose to base them on a broader range of expenditure from the EU budget than before. In a nutshell, all member states should in the future face the risk of losing money from the EU budget in case of persistent non-respect of the fiscal rules. The application of these rules should also be quasi-automatic as regards the corrective arm of the Stability and Growth Pact. The timing of measures is also key. We must not fall into the trap of waiting too long before sanctions kick in. Incentives and sanctions must be brought upstream so that action is deployed before the situation gets out of hand. Preventive action can be much more effective than corrective action, but it requires discipline and political will. One of the weakest points of our current rules is the absence of mechanisms to deal with problems appearing in so-called good times. We are addressing this in our proposals, in particular as regards the euro area. Third, our surveillance needs to capture all the key elements. It must not be restricted to fiscal policy alone. We have seen that such a narrow perspective does not work. We must have the tools to detect macroeconomic imbalances among member states. Such imbalances weaken the cohesion of the EU and in particular of the euro area. A comprehensive scoreboard of indicators will give us what we need to identify increasing divergences and to propose remedies. They need, of course, to be complemented by appropriate enforcement mechanisms for such remedies. Fourth, as well as stricter fiscal rules, we also need to push the structural reforms, innovation and trade that will put Europe back on track in terms of growth and create jobs for the future. That is what our Europe 2020 strategy is all about. The European Council endorsed it a fortnight ago. Now we need to put it into practice to ensure that national and European policies are fully in tune, creating the virtuous cycle where growth in one part of Europe helps drive growth in another. Fifth, let me repeat the utmost importance of transparent and robust financial market regulation and call on all actors in the process to adopt the necessary reforms as quickly as possible. I would like to underline the historic dimension of the reforms we are putting forward. They constitute an answer to the challenges that our single currency is facing in Europe, but they also have an important impact in the global financial markets. The time has come to give to the Economic and Monetary Union the tools it needs to fully function in order to ensure its credibility. What is at stake is not just some technical rules. What is at stake is the future of the euro, and we can say to some extent it's the future of our European project. To make all this possible, we have to show without any possible doubt that the world has changed, and that our proposals on economic governance are not more of the same, but a real breakthrough. Today the conditions are met to bring together Stability and Growth Pact, economic governance and the structural reforms in a consistent system within the Economic and Monetary Union. This system should harness all our tools to the common objective: the structural funds, budget surveillance and the reforms foreseen in the Europe 2020 strategy. This is a strategy for the whole Union. This is not just an addition of different strategies. It is a real economic strategy for Europe. But we can only have a European economic strategy if you have a truly economic system of governance. However, the system of incentives and sanctions should reflect the special responsibilities of Member States that have already adopted the single currency in strict compliance with the legal framework. Those Member States share a common good called the euro, and it will not be acceptable that the misbehaviour of some members will put at risk all the others. I am convinced that these proposals will mean a step change in the economic consistency of the Union, while at the same time preserving the inevitable specificities between those Member States who are members of the euro area and, of course, respecting those who are not yet. The current situation requires ambition and boldness. The proposals of the Commission will send out a strong message, both inside the EU and worldwide, that the European Union is equal to the task. It is therefore paramount that our three institutions work consistently and in a spirit of close cooperation to finalise and approve these proposals with mutual confidence and belief in our common future. It is important that all our partners worldwide understand that we are ready to do whatever it takes to defend the euro and the stability of our common currency. The Commission's task is to use its right of initiative to further the common interest of Europe and its citizens. It is determined to fulfil this task and convinced that these proposals are the right way forward for Europe. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. President of the Commission. Thank you for introducing the debate today, and thank you very much for the statements you have just made. We will now turn to speakers on behalf of the political groups, and I give the floor to Ms. WORTMANN-KOOL for the EPP.
Thank you very much, President. President Barroso, Commissioner Rehn, your proposals are an important contribution to strengthening economic governance in Europe. So I'd like to praise you that you've been active and you're not just waiting to see what the task force comes up with. The EPP is positive on the proposals, and together with you and the Council we'd like to work together so that these can be put into practice. We'd like to work together to take further steps towards a community approach. No new institutions, but rather a stronger and more independent role of the European Commission, a European Council with a joint approach and democratic control by the European Parliament. The EPP group think that these are the facts which are necessary for the legislative proposals you're submitting. We expect a lot of the European half-year, the coordination of national action plans. Important reforms in the member states are necessary in order to improve the competitiveness of our member states. That will create jobs and prosperity for our citizens. We expect a lot from the measures to reinforce the Stability and Growth Pact. With sanctions, of course, they must be behind that. And further measures, a lot will depend on how the specifics will look. The Dutch football team doesn't go for words, but rather deeds. And deeds and not words are what the Parliament wants when it comes to strengthening the economic region. And deeds are not words when it comes for legislation for financial supervision. The Council endorsed the report by Jacques de la Rosière, but that has to be translated into legal acts and must get real competences for the authority. And now the Council must become active. The Parliament will vote tomorrow, but the door is open for the Council so that in ECOFIN this month an agreement can be reached. That means that when it comes to the powers for the new supervisory boards, but we'll be active not just in our own interests but in the interests of citizens, so that we can look to the future with confidence. Thank you.
Dziękuję.
Thank you very much. I now call on behalf of the S&D group our colleague Stephen Hughes. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, President. President Barroso and Commissioner Rehn, we worry that your proposals lack balance. Fiscal stability cannot exist in isolation from strong economic growth and high levels of employment. Current and further planned austerity measures will lead to a sustained period of low growth and increasing unemployment and further social exclusion. I know that you don't believe, President Barroso, that millions more unemployed and more social exclusion are an acceptable price to pay for rapid fiscal consolidation, but that seems to be the path you're treading. In your proposals of last week, I think you're missing the point. There is a need for a qualitative leap in European economic policy and in its governance, but that should lead to a balanced policy agenda combining fiscal responsibility with economic effectiveness and social fairness. You've left out several highly relevant options that would really mean a qualitative leap in this field. Real economic policy coordination should provide for a more differentiated consolidation plan for Europe instead of a short-sighted, one-size-fits-all austerity agenda that makes no economic sense. Secondly, you must come forward with an economic policy agenda for jobs and fiscal consolidation. Today we only have an agenda for cutting deficits at the expense of jobs. Third, we need strong proposals on how to safeguard proper public financing for the recently agreed Europe 2020 strategy, including new tax revenues from financial transaction taxes and other sources. And we also urgently need operational proposals from you, the Commission, on how to shift the tax burden away from labour as rapidly as possible. Taxation on labour is far too high in a number of Member States. And last but not least, you've stopped short of positive incentives rather than negative sanctions in a renewed Stability and Growth Pact, although that could be a very promising path to tread. I hope you'll reconsider and come forward with a more balanced set of proposals in the autumn.
Dziękuję koledze za zabranie.
Thank you very much. I now call the chairman of the ALDE group, VERHOFSTADT.
Oui, d'abord, Monsieur le Président.
First of all, Mr. President, I'm pleased with the way you've presented the package on behalf of the Commission. And if I can give an opinion, I consider that as soon as possible, on the basis of your right of initiative, do that, go ahead. Put it to Council and to the European Parliament, because that is what the EU is all about. The Commission, in terms of the mechanics, has the right to take that initiative, and it is the Commission that then has to take the responsibility of tabling a proposal to the various institutions. However, in this package, Mr. President, there are still questions. First of all, the basic one, who is going to be responsible for managing this European economic governance? Is it the Member States, is it the Council, or is it community institutions, in other words, the ECB and the European Commission? As far as the EP is concerned, we consider it straightforward. It will be the communities, the Union's bodies, because the Member States cannot be responsible for scrutinising themselves. That's never worked in the past, and it would not work in the future either. Secondly, yes to sanctions, but not only within the Stability Pact, because, as you said, that's just one aspect of this policy. We also need to ensure, looking at competitiveness, for example, or structural reforms, or the European economy. There must be penalties, there must be sanctions provided for, and I would ask certain Member States to be rather more consistent in their approach. They defend or even insist on sanctions within the package, but when we're talking about sanctions in terms of 2020 or in terms of competitiveness, they're rather more reticent. So it has to be one or the other, and we need to apply this right across the board. Third comment. We also think, Mr. President of the Commission, we need to think about a strategy for economic growth. We cannot only say, fine, we brought down deficits. Well, I used to be a budgets minister myself, and I like bringing deficits down. But apart from that, we also need to have an economic growth policy, and the only body, the only institution, the only body that can do this is the European Union, because it has this capacity to borrow. The European Union has infrastructure projects which are pan-European, which we need, and these are all in the Monti report. So it is along those lines that the Commission needs to come up with proposals. Not just to reduce deficits, which of course is necessary under the Stability Pact, but in addition to that, we need a credible economic growth strategy so that we don't fall into the trap of a Japanese-style stagnation that we've seen for many years. And then the stress test. I'm very pleased that the decision has been taken to make it public. I think it's something that should have been done a year ago, like the Americans did, because that is the only way of ensuring that we have private sector financing made available. And my last point, and this is the final point, with regard to financial supervision, I think we need to be quite clear that there will be no agreement with the European Parliament unless the Council and the Member States respect the fact that it's a European authority that will have the last word in the case of conflict. That is the key point. And I think it's already taken up in the Commission's proposal. That was really the starting point. The Member States have not yet understood, they have not yet got the message, Mr. President. But they need to accept that, otherwise there will be no agreement on that.
Mr. President, I would like to disturb any exciting speech, but you know, it was slightly too long. Well, sorry. Colleague Sven GIEGOLD, Greens in European Parliament, please.
Yeah. Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much for the presentation of this communication. I think it's clear, and colleagues, we ought to be cautious. We're in a very difficult situation, and we shouldn't continue in the old pattern. That means the right says that budget deficits and competitiveness problems, and the political left focuses on the risks of austerity. I don't think that'll bring us any further. I think if you look at this proposal fairly, you have to see that there is important progress there. There's important progress when it comes to budget coordination, also saying that imbalances need to be mentioned clearly. That was impossible before. That's progress, that there can be sanctions if Member States don't do their homework. But at the same time, this proposal does have blind spots, and these blind spots, I think, we can't allow that for ourselves or our citizens. Of course, there must be economic governance, so we must be able to talk about taxes. We have tax havens, we have big areas of the economy which aren't taxed, and we have excessive tax competition, and that can't continue, and that needs to be mentioned in this sort of statement. Secondly, it isn't enough to have budget policy to be coordinated in the way it's been described. We must make sure that budget policy becomes anti-cyclical to avoid crises. That's not in the text. Also, it's still a taboo to say in public that when it comes to the imbalances, there are deficit and surplus countries, and both sides have their own contribution to make. But you don't dare to say that very clearly yet. We have problems in terms of property prices and bubbles. That also hasn't been mentioned directly. So the point I want to make is, let's be honest and put our ideologies to one side in the crisis and look at the causes of the crises before looking at these, apart from looking at these things in a one-sided way. Citizens expect comprehensive solutions, and they've earned that.
Swinburne, Conservatives and Reformists.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Economic governance, supervisory architecture, cross-border crisis management tools, these are all very important areas post the financial crisis. For all these areas, we need to ensure that a strong and resilient structure needs to be put in place as soon as possible in order to ensure that we can deliver a common set of rules, whether for Member States' accounts and their behaviour in economic governance or for our financial services reform. We need to arrive at consensus. The outcome needs to be fully implemented by all 27 Member States and be fully complied with. Any new institutions need to be apolitical, and recruitment of staff based on merit and ability to do the task at hand above all else. We need to send a clear signal that these new procedures and supervisory authorities, especially the proposed European Systemic Risk Board, are necessary and can work for the benefit of our constituents and our collective economies. The recent financial and economic crisis has necessitated bold measures. In Europe, we have identified areas in which regulatory gaps can be bridged and will hopefully also improve the transparency of our markets and financial services as a whole. The recent agreement on the US finance bill has been hailed by many as putting the US regulatory reform ahead of the EU. I don't agree with this conclusion. If we can find agreement on the supervisory architecture over the coming days and weeks, we will have a robust EU framework centred on a new European Systemic Risk Board and the three Lamfalussy committees transformed into European authorities. Once this framework has been established, it should aid the safety of the financial system and may even prove to be a vehicle to improve the functioning of the single market in financial services. In following this agenda, we do, however, need to ensure that any new authorities established work effectively with national supervisory bodies, and that at all times these discussions and negotiations strive for the best structure, the best supervision and the best outcome, rather than whether it is more or less Europe. I commend the Commission's focus on addressing the key issues of concern and believe that although by very different methods, we will soon end up with a global financial system which is safer and better serves our economy.
Thank you very much, Madam. Colleague Lothar Bisky, United Left.
Thank you very much, President. After the Commission in recent weeks has come along to save the euro and its 2020 strategy and has come up with measures to prevent crises, to save banks and to introduce social cuts, now we have proposals to reform the Stability and Growth Pact. These proposals from the Commission to reform the Stability and Growth Pact, as we see it, go in the wrong direction. The Commission wants, as the working group and the Van Rompuy group, don't want to change the substance of the pact, but rather they want to beef up sanctions. The Commission and the Council are calling for more control and more punishment for deficit countries. This hasn't worked in the past and it won't work in the future. We on the left in the European Parliament are happy that at least the worst penalty proposals for deficit countries have not been accepted by the Commission. The financial market regulation is urgently required. We'll make our contribution to that. The citizens must pay. Now the Council ought to make some movement. The problems of the Stability and Growth Pact are not in its lack of reform of deficits and the Maastricht goal of 3% indebtedness. It means that there will be less growth and growth will be choked off in the Eurozone. The imbalances that exist in the EU must be removed. That's what the speculators live from. That includes that the strong countries should give up their aggressive export strategies which have destructive consequences for other countries. These countries must do more to strengthen the internal market and encourage growth. Stability and Growth Pact must include a criteria like unemployment and reducing poverty. We don't need to beef it up. We need a thoroughgoing reform.
Mr. Godfrey BLOOM, Freedom and Democracy.
Mr. President, Commissioners, the three amigos, if I may call you such. Last session, Mr. President, you had to scamper away. I think you had an urgent appointment. You missed my words of wisdom. I'm glad to see that you're here to receive them today because I feel I have some wisdom to offer. You're in such a pickle, actually, aren't you? One could almost feel sorry for you. But, of course, you know you bring some of this on yourselves. The common currency experiment, which is an experiment, which was doomed to failure, and I remember lecturing at Cambridge University back in the 90s, explaining why it was deeply flawed and couldn't work. And I gave it about 10 years, and I'm afraid it looks like I was right. It was even flawed with your own rule book. And what actually happened when you introduced it, you actually tore up your own rule book. You threw it away. You welcomed every fiscal dysfunctional economy into the Eurozone, including Greece, which was going to hasten the demise of the Eurozone, and it comes as no surprise. I'm not a Johnny-come-lately to the demise of the Euro. It was always written in the runes, as it were. And to suggest now that we've only just found out that Greece was broke is intellectually dishonest. I was in the city at the time and we were buying Greek bonds at 10% coupons and they fell to 5. It was a one-way bet. A bit like having the winner of the horse before the race had even started. And our banks, our commercial banks, have got themselves into a terrible problem because they buy junk debt, they redistributed junk debt, repackaged to AAA ratings. What are our central banks doing now? The very same thing. They're buying in the secondary market, they're buying junk bonds, repackaging it as AAA, and this is just how we got into this pickle to start with. If you want to get out of this mess, you want to get rid of the political establishment support for commercial banks and get rid of central banks, which are actually part of the problem, not the solution.
Thank you, colleague. Madame Marine Le Pen.
Well, the Eurozone is experiencing unprecedented decline, lowest growth in the world, highest rates of unemployment and declining competitivity. It's a total washout. Obviously, Greece is already affected. Spain, Portugal, Italy and France will be next in line with the general impoverishment of the populations of those countries. Now, you've been talking about harmonising the EU, but you are in fact driving us all over the edge of a cliff. And this is a tragedy unfolding before our eyes. Now, we've had this totalitarian, uniform currency imposed on member states. You've encouraged speculation. And how can you explain that Spain, which had a budgetary surplus of 2% in 2007, is now running a deficit of 12% on its public accounts? And this has in fact promoted unprecedented property speculation, and the whole country is now peppered with empty homes. And then of course we have the subprime scandal, which sends shivers down our spine. It seems to me that you've failed across the board. You've tried to get the EU to have a stranglehold on national budgets upstream, but that certainly won't solve things at all.
Mr. President, the floor is yours for last remarks in our debate.
Thank you very much. I will try to respond to some of the concrete questions. First of all, to Corien WORTMANN-KOOL, thank you for your support. In fact, we believe this will enhance the credibility of our Stability and Growth Pact, but also of the euro and of the European project as a whole. And we believe the Parliament should be closely associated to all these efforts. In the last European Council, where the President Buzek was there, I made it a point that the Parliament should be kept informed of all the progress of the discussions for the future economic governance of Europe. Some of the concerns expressed by Mr. Hughes and also from Mr. Bisky, I think they should be considered, but in fact I believe our proposal is considering your concerns. Because what is new in this proposal is that we are saying that the Stability and Growth Pact is not everything, that we are linking the analysis of the implementation of the measures in the framework of the Stability and Growth Pact with the macroeconomic imbalances, with the problems of divergences in competitiveness. So in fact what we are proposing is a holistic approach that does not look only to the macroeconomic aspects but looks also to growth, as Guy Verhofstadt was suggesting, looks also to innovation, to the reforms. That is precisely our goal with EU 2020. And yes, Mr. Verhofstadt, as you rightly mentioned, we are concerned now with the internal market. And based on the report presented by Mario Monti, a report I have asked him to present, we are now working, and Commissioner Barnier will come in the fall with very important proposals, a Single Market Act precisely, to address these issues. So our proposal is not only about prudence in macroeconomic aspects. Today we are discussing the governance, the economic governance, so it's natural that we look at what did not go well, but I want to underline this point. This is not just about macroeconomic prudence, it's also about growth and about our reform agenda. And what is new here is that we have now, if of course at the end we can have this plan agreed, for the first time we have this comprehensive approach, trying to look at all the aspects. You remember that some months before, when I presented the Europe 2020 strategy, there were in some quarters in Europe some people saying, no, you cannot link it to the Stability and Growth Pact because it may weaken the Stability and Growth Pact. I think now everybody agrees that it makes no sense to discuss the macroeconomic constraints and not to discuss structural reform and not to consider competitiveness. That is why I also don't agree with the idea that our approach is not balanced. In EU 2020, we were fighting for inclusion of targets like reduction of poverty, education and employment. So in fact it is a very balanced approach, the one in which we try to combine all the instruments of economic policy, have a European dimension, have a national dimension, and have at the same time objectives related to competitiveness, objectives related to social inclusion and to education. You are right, Mr. Verhofstadt. It's up to the Commission to make the proposals, and that's what we are doing, and we will come with the formal proposals. It is a very important reform, the one is going on. That is why Olli Rehn is giving his very important input also on behalf of the Commission to the task force. We believe it is important to bring some consensus, because these are very important changes. But of course, when it will come to the moment of presenting the legislative proposals, the Commission will do it, and that is precisely the best way to have your Parliament associated. But we also want, in this holistic approach, to have macroeconomic surveillance with teeth. It is not only about the sanctions for those who do not fulfil the criteria of debt and deficit. We will also try to reinforce the coordination in terms of the macroeconomic imbalances. You also mentioned, some of you mentioned the supervision. And once again, I would like to remember that our aim remains to have the new authorities in place at the start of 2011. We need this since our whole reform is based on this new architecture. In the last days, the new Belgian presidency has renewed momentum towards a deal. There is a predominant sense of constructive pragmatism from both sides. I am grateful for the ambition the Parliament has been showing. I am grateful for that strong support. At the same time, I would like to ask you to make all your efforts to reach a satisfactory deal in the next few days. I believe now it appears within grasp. The Commission has contributed through various compromise texts and is very pleased that progress is being made. We now call on both co-legislators to maintain the positive dynamic. As Mrs. Swinburne said, and she is right, the Americans have announced the political agreement, but they have not yet legislation. Sometimes when you read the press, it appears that Americans are much more advanced than we are. It's not true. President Obama said in the G20 that he got a bipartisan agreement. Great, and we welcome that. But in reality, we should be able to conclude our legislative work much before our American partners, and I believe we should do that to show also our leadership in terms of the financial regulation and supervision at global level. That could only enhance the role of Europe in this matter. Finally, some of you spoke about stress testing. As you know, the Commission is playing an important role in promoting transparency and communicating the results of the ongoing stress testing of banks. At the last European Council, I made a strong plea to make the results public. As you know, this is a national competence. But I am indeed extremely pleased with the European Council agreement to do so. This decision should reassure investors by either lifting unfounded suspicion or by dealing with the remaining problems that may exist. I am very confident in the overall resilience of the EU banking industry, but we must identify possible pockets of vulnerability and deal with them. A fully transparent stress test provides an opportunity to do so. Backstop mechanisms must be designed for activation in case of need, and this is once again a national responsibility. If state intervention is needed, this will be examined by the Commission in a timely manner under the Community state aid rules. The European decision to publish individual results of bank stress tests was indeed very well received by the G20 leaders in Toronto last weekend, and we believe this is the way to restore confidence in our overall system. So, as you see, distinguished members of this Parliament, we are acting on several fronts. Today I have presented to you the proposals made more recently in terms of economic governance. But we should not separate those proposals from the other efforts that we are pursuing to give more coherence to our economic policy, to understand that a monetary union without some kind of economic coordination indeed does not make sense, and I believe it is in the interest of all our citizens, the stability of the euro. It is in the interest certainly of the euro area, but it is in the interest of all the European Union, and it is also in the interest of all those who want open markets, open economies and open societies. Thank you for your attention.
Mr. President, for your approach, for your cooperation with the European Parliament. I am closing the debate. Kolejnym punktem porządku dziennego.
The next item on our agenda is a joint debate on financial supervision and economic governance. Mr. Tremosa-Balzer's report is concerned with specific tasks concerning the functioning of the European Systemic Risk Board, and these tasks being referred to the European Central Bank, and Mr. Sánchez-Presedo, power of the European Banking Authority, European Insurance and Occupational Pensions Authority, and the European Securities and Markets Authority. Also, we have Mr. Giegold's report, European Securities and Markets Authority. In addition to that, Madame Goulard's report, Macroprudential Oversight of the Financial System and Establishment of a European Systemic Risk Board. In addition to that, we have Mr. García-Marfil's report on the European Banking Authority, Mr. Skinner's report, European Insurance and Occupational Pensions Authority. And after that, Ms. Ferreira's report, Cross-Border Crisis Management in the Banking Sector. So, first of all, the rapporteurs will be given the floor. First of all, Mr. Ramon Tremosa-Balzers, for 4 minutes, please.
Moltes gràcies, senyor.
Thank you very much, sir.
At the origin of this financial crisis, there are the national supervisors. Our financial markets are integrated at the European level, and in every country, the main financial institutions are cross-border institutions. But the financial supervision has remained only at the national level. At this stage, and with the huge crisis we are suffering, there are only two possibilities. We can reinforce the national supervisors, or we can create European supervisors in order to adapt European financial supervision to the globalization process. In this report, I propose a closer link between the European Central Bank and the European Systemic Risk Board. The President of the ECB shall also be the chair of the ESRB and shall represent the ESRB externally. In my opinion, the European Central Bank has gained credibility and has become an institution of worldwide renown in this financial crisis. It has been recognized all over the world and also by some Anglo-Saxon experts as David Marsh, the chairman of the London and Oxford Group. In my opinion, the European Central Bank is the only European independent institution that will have moral and material authority to play an important role in the future European supervision on both financial markets and financial institutions. Dear colleagues, to justify why it is needed a closer link between the ECB and the ESRB, we can see what is happening in other countries out of the Eurozone. 3 weeks ago, it was my pleasure to read in the Financial Times that Mr. George Osborne, the UK Conservative Finance Minister, has decided the biggest overhaul of city regulation since 1997. The UK splits the main financial regulator and gives more power and more clout to the Bank of England. In the same direction that we now propose, the UK has abolished the English tripartite structure, confirmed by the Bank of England, the Financial Services Authority and the Treasury. Mr. Osborne said that it had failed in preventing the crisis because no one knew who was in charge.